If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn it to Luke chapter 1. We're still there. The birth of John the Baptizer. It's an enormous occasion for Zechariah and Elizabeth. They were too old to have children. God has given them this child. And the people in the community around them recognized that John was going to be somebody special because of the circumstances of his birth, the fact that Zechariah couldn't speak for the entirety of the pregnancy. People recognized something was happening. Let's take a look at this text. I'm going to begin reading in verse 57. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her his great mercy, and they shared in her happiness. And on the 8th day they came to circumcise the boy, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he's to be called John," which at that moment was a pretty big deal that she spoke up.
Yeah.
She shouldn't have done that. They said to her, "There is no one among your relatives who has that name." So they made signs to Zechariah to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet because he couldn't speak. And to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." And immediately his mouth was then opened and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak, praising God. The neighbors were all filled with awe. And throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all of these things. There was a lot of gossip going on. Everyone who heard these things wondered about it and said, "When is this child? What then will this child be? For the Lord's hand is surely with him." Now, Zechariah and Elizabeth are a Jewish couple. And so if you're a Jewish couple at this time in history, birth is a big deal. But it's especially a big deal if you have a son. That was important to the Jews. For a Jewish household, a boy was going to be a blessing at this time in history. Now, today, things are different. But at that time in history, if a Jewish household had a boy, they would invite musicians over. And the musicians would, nobody knew that it's going to be a boy or a girl, right? You didn't go to the ultrasound at the Jerusalem clinic. You didn't know what you were going to have. And so if a boy came, the musicians would break into music at your house. And they would play happy songs because you've got a boy. If it were a girl, they'd break into a funerary dirge.
Oh. I don't think
Now,
I get the voice.
let me explain. Why was this? Why was there this huge distinction between a boy and a girl? There's a rabbinical saying at the time in history in which this happens, and the rabbinical saying goes this way: the birth of a male child brings universal happiness. The birth of a female child brings universal sorrow. This is a confusing thing to our ears. We don't have any matrix to plug this into. I mean, if you have a baby and it's healthy, 10 toes, 10 fingers, everybody's dancing around pretty happy about that. But at this time in history, it's not that way. Why? In a Jewish household, if you had a girl, it was going to be costly. That's why. You were going to pour your efforts just as you would if it were a boy, and you were going to raise this girl. And then when she got of marrying age, she was going to leave your house. That's why it was a kind of a funeral in a way. Because at this time in history, it's an agrarian culture. Now, in the priestly household, not so much. But still, there was this Jewish understanding, this Jewish environment. And from an agrarian standpoint, you were losing a farmhand. Simple as that. If you had a boy, the boy, when he reaches the age of marrying, he's going to go out and bring a girl home. And they're going to have kids, and pretty soon you're going to have a whole bunch of farmhands working. So it was a blessing if it was a boy, but it was costly if it was a girl. And this is just the ethos in which they lived. This is how they saw things. But I want to say something. I know we look at that, we say, wow, I could see all the faces in the room of the girls in this room today who looked at that and said, I don't understand. That doesn't sound good to me. It doesn't sound good to any of us. But there were some good things about a Jewish household, no matter whether it was a girl or a boy. The Jews, this is so countercultural. In the Roman Empire, we've talked about this many times before, and I think it's very befitting. that we talk, I didn't plan this, by the way, that we talk about this on Right to Life Sunday. There were no abortions in Jewish households. There was no infanticide. In the Roman and Greek and pagan households, if you had, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, if I recollect. I kind of remember my sermons. I don't know if you're aware of that. But as I recollect, if you were a pagan, a Roman, a Greek, or a Carthaginian, whatever you were, if you had a child in your home and the child was sickly, or you already had too many, if you had too many, you might try once your wife was pregnant to abort the child. That was very common. Just because we've got too many, we don't need another one to feed here. If the child was sickly, you would take the child after birth and you would take it out. And if you said, you know, we really can't do this, and you'd put it in the bushes somewhere and you'd wait for the wild animals to get it overnight. Now we go, oh, that's terrible. They didn't think this was even controversial. We think it's bad in America now. It's not bad here. 1.5 million abortions a year are bad, but good grief, I don't know of anybody that puts their children out in the bushes on a routine basis here. It happens occasionally, but not that often. So the Jews practiced none of this. It didn't matter if you had 20 children. If you had one more, it's going to be tough to feed all these children. But this is a gift from God. In other words, the sanctity of life was embedded in the fact that this person is now here, because this is an image bearer. In our culture right now, people do not have any anchor for why you and I or any of us are worth anything. Did you know that? If you are a person, not you, but if a person is a non-believer, an atheist or an agnostic, a person who does not believe there is a God, our human worth is anchored in absolutely nothing except what a government or others say we are worth. Now you can understand why in Nazi Germany there was a man who was running a care home for epileptics in Nazi Germany. This happened. And the Gestapo came. And you know, the Gestapo, at this time in history, the final solution didn't just have to do with the Jews. It had to do with anybody who was an unproductive burden on the Nazi state. And they came to the epileptic home. And the director of that home threw himself in front of the Gestapo and said, if you're going to take these people away and kill them, you're going to have to kill me with them. Because that's exactly what they came to do. An epileptic in that culture was worthless. How does anybody have worth that rises above what somebody else says their worth is? We're made in the image of God. That image-bearing capacity that we have been given by God. Look, Martin Luther King's work to set things right with regard to civil rights that we just take for granted. Go back and read your Bill of Rights and see how they anchor it. How are the rights inalienable? They're inalienable because they've been given to us because of our humanity by a creator. If you take that word creator out, we have no rights except what somebody else says we have. And all of our human worth is then just conferred. We're headed that way as a world right now. People think secularism is a good thing. They don't know what they're asking for. It's not a good thing, because human worth will then be no more. Sam Harris's moral landscape is not a good landscape, because just to say we anchor human worth in what it is as a society that creates human flourishment, what if the humans that are flourishing are undesirable to flourish? Who's going to say, you can't do that? You can't get rid of the epileptics. Who's going to say that? And on what basis? Unless we're created in God's image, there is no basis. And this is what set the Jews apart. They believed that. So there were no infanticides or abortions in a Jewish household. If your whole family was composed of girls, you had the funerary march every time one came, but you raised them and you loved them. So it was very, very different. So we shouldn't be too hard on this very paternal society that viewed men as more important. That's just the society as it was given in the first century. On the 8th day, you would circumcise a male child, a bris. I've been to one. Pretty big deal. And that's when you name them, on the 8th day. And so they choose a name. Jewish names meant something always. If you go back in the Bible, you will not find one single Jewish person who's not named for a reason. Esau and Jacob. Esau means hairy. And he was hairy. Jacob means the one who grabs hold, or the supplanter. That's what he did. So they named their boy. He came out holding onto Esau's heel, the one who grasps the heel. Laban. Remember Laban? What does Laban mean? He must have been blonde, because that's what it means. They named their children on the basis of things that meant something. Samuel and Saul, both of them. You remember Hannah prayed, wanted a son so badly. When the son came, she named him Samuel and dedicated him to the Lord. Samuel means asked for. John. What does John mean? They looked and they said, look, you're going to name him Zechariah, right? That's your name. You're a priest. It's your only son. And that was the tradition. You named your child after the father. If it was a male child, that would be Zechariah the second. That's just what you would do. And the wife spoke up, which she shouldn't have done. She's not supposed to be saying anything at this ceremony. She says, no, his name is John. John is short for Yohanan, which means God's gift. God's gift. So, in the Jewish household, children are a treasure. But now I want to take this, and I promise you, I marvel myself that this sermon is what it is on Right to Life Sunday. I did not plan this. It just dawned on me this morning as I was reading it, and I got the text telling me what time to be where. Children are a treasure in the Jewish household, but just like in any household, they are a responsibility. So you've got this dual setup. It's kind of like our country. Our country is unique on the earth. You know why? Because we reconcile two opposite things: liberty and law. And those two things are what make our country, in our case, what it is. Our ethic is derived from reconciling liberty, do whatever you want, be whatever you want, and law. So in this particular case, you've got that kind of duality in the Jewish household. You've got the treasure, but then you've got responsibility as well for any child born. Now, we in the West look at things a lot differently than the Jewish household did. I remember reading as I was preparing, and I thought, Jesus said some stuff about children. And I thought, what a great place to insert that as a text. So I did. And he says, see to it that you don't look down on any of these little ones, for I tell you there are angels in heaven who see the face of my Father. Now think about what that means. Every child that came to Jesus and jumped up in his lap, that they were saying, let's get them out of here. The teacher's got to teach. Jesus says, no, you let them come. Their angels see the face of my Father in heaven. That means to each child is assigned, and Jesus said it, I didn't make it up. Jesus gave us a window into heaven for just a little bit and said, this is how it is. There are angels assigned to these children who see my Father's face all the time. That's a big deal, isn't it? I think about that in terms of a child in an abusive home, or a child who's abandoned, or a child in China who's a girl who's going to be put to death because she's a girl. God has an angel assigned to that child. That angel sees God's face in heaven all the time. We in the West abort 1.5 million children a year. That's what we do. And that's 1.5 human beings that could be of great significance. I remember reading about this British schoolmaster in Britain. C.S. Lewis went to a boarding school when he was a kid. And there was this old schoolmaster, and talked about him as being rather portly. And he would come in and you ever look at some of these people who dress up in the 19th century? It must take you 30 minutes just to put all that stuff on. There's 4 or 5 collars. there's a little thingy that comes around your neck, and then there's this little tie that sticks out, and then you got some wrapping, and then you got a sweater, and then you got a jacket, and it just goes on and on and on. I'm thinking, man, in the summer, that's just got to be a killer. And just to go out to you and I might go to breakfast wearing a t-shirt and a pair of dungarees. They dressed up like that to just go out to the mailbox. So this portly schoolmaster came in, and his tradition was the first day of boarding school, it was all boys because they separate the boys and the girls in boarding school in England at this time. He would bow in front of the class and then stand up and then move over to his desk. And somebody came to him once and said, "What's the deal with that bowing thing? What are you doing?" He said, "I look out there and I see a bunch of faces, and I don't know what any one of those little children's going to be. What are they going to be? They may be somebody, the potential for somebody great sits in that classroom." Well, we're taking 1.5 million of those potentials for somebody great and tossing them in a dumpster in our culture. You never know who one of these little ones will turn out to be. But you see, in the Jewish house, this respect for a child was supreme. Yeah, they had the funeral music if it was a girl, but the respect for the child was supreme. Elizabeth grew up like that. She grew up loved in her household because she was a person, not because of anything that had to do with working out that treasure and responsibility. We in the West look at things totally different. This is what I'm talking about when I say when we ask to have freedom from God's existence and God's input, we don't know what we're asking for. We're asking to say we want to be cut off from any sense of worth that we might have that says I'm worth everything. And now if we do that, then you can understand why 1.5 million are done away with every year, because what are they worth? What's a baby going to do? The Jewish gratitude to God for children was completely countercultural in that day, in the Roman Empire. But we in the individualistic West, everything for us is how can I be the most I can be? That's right. How can I? Think about how many, I want to just ask some questions here of us this morning, and I'm not saying this to anybody, but I think this is worth thinking about. Maybe there are things that I'm sure all of us could repent from in terms of the way we handled our children. I know I can. How many of us in this room had something that we did that we thought was so important that we would push children aside in order to do it? All of us, right? I mean, let's just be honest for a moment. All of us have things in our lives that we felt were so important. Now, we might say things like, I've got to make a living. Well, you do. We do. That's true. But did we craft our life in such a way that outside of that, they were important? I can't answer that for anybody except myself, and I'll tell you, I have things I need to repent of in the way that we raised Jackson. But you see, and I don't want to be hard on anybody, but it's because we in the West think of ourselves as important. That's true, we are. Jesus died for every one of us. But that sense of importance in who we are and what we become, when the little child comes into the home, that needs to be set aside far more than it is. And we don't do that in the West. That's why 1.5 million get aborted every year. You can't tell me that 1.5 million are all rape victims. That's less than 1% of all of that. Nor can you tell me that 1.5 million are medical, that the mother's going to die if she has this child. The family is where our view of who God is and what Jesus, who He is and how He loves us, the family is where that is learned. That's where it's learned. Go back and read Deuteronomy, and you see Moses telling the Jews, you go home and you remember these things and you teach them to your children and you remind them and you nail them to the doorpost, and when you come and when you go and when you get up, when you go to bed, these things should be on your lips, so that these little children who are with you, you're not making them learn it by whipping them into shape. They're seeing it lived. every day. That's how they learn. These things are caught. They're not taught. I can remember, you probably can too. I knew many families when Jackson was growing up. I won't say anything about who or anything. It doesn't matter. But I'll say this. I saw it. They would drive up to the church. The kids would get out. They would go inside and the car would leave. And then at the end of church, you'd see that car pull up. The kids would get in and they'd go home. Why? We want our children in church. A waste of time. A waste of time because they know mom and dad don't believe it. You can't do that. It does not work. I grew up in a household very much like that, wherein what was taught in church was not believed in my home, and I saw my family live in a way that was the exact opposite of everything I was hearing. So what did I think when I grew up? None of this is real. Doesn't matter. I'll tell you, it's a shame. This is where, for me, biblical teaching properly done is so important. We read Proverbs 22. Train a child up in the way that they should go, and when they're older, they won't depart from it. That's misread, by the way. What it says is, it'll not depart from them. But that is, please don't mishear me, that is not a promise. That is not a promise. That is a way of living that is better than its opposite. Because there are families, they pour into their children, they do the best they can, they love Jesus, they live it in their home, and the child becomes wayward. If it's a promise, how do you make that work for them? But it's what generally will happen. If the family lives it in the home and the children see it lived, it will not depart from them. That is for sure. They will remember what they saw. And you and I in this room, we're God's children. Isn't that amazing? I mean, we don't like to think. I shouldn't say that. I bet there are minds in this room this morning who do not like to think of themselves as children. I understand that. The Bible says we're God's children. By creation. That means all those people who don't believe and everything else, they're God's children too. By creation. But guess what? We become heirs by adoption. And that's what we are. Heirs. Jesus said, let the little children come to me. Don't hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to them. And I'll tell you the truth, anybody who won't come to me and receive the kingdom of God like a child will not enter it. Will not enter it. I'll tell you what. I hate that phrase. I say it's a southern. I'll tell you what. Everybody keep this in mind if you don't remember anything else I said, which is possible. The legacy of parenting is this. We are here on this earth to teach children to trust us. That's why we're here. That's what it means to be a parent. A parent is not a sperm donor or a womb. A parent is somebody who instills in children that they can trust mom and dad. You know what that translates into? They learn that they can trust God too. Without that, it's very difficult for them to ever see that they can believe God. Think of any child who's grown up in an abusive home and find out and ask yourself, do they trust God like that? If they do, it's a miracle. Because God has seen fit to touch them in some way. But we have that responsibility, parents, grandparents, adults, to instill in children that we trust God and that we are trustworthy. And the children see that and they learn that they can trust God too. They grow up with it and it will not depart from them. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me about the sermon, you didn't like